All right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Happy, warm Monday night. My name is Susan Zell, and I have the pleasure of being one of your co-hosts for tonight. We're going to have a topic tonight called wildlife corridors: how native trees and plants can restore Hampton Roads biodiversity. The presentation discusses the growing biodiversity loss due to development, parcel fragmentation, and invasive species. A viable solution is to introduce habitat to developed areas and private lands. This talk will demonstrate the different ways to accomplish this goal. A few housekeeping rules, if you'll pay attention. This program is about 50 minutes in length with 10 minutes for questions at the end. Please mute your speaker and take yourself off video to prevent any distractions. The chat box will be open for questions for Kendall. One of our co-hosts will collate the questions for her to answer. If by any chance you have ideas for other topics or speakers for future presentations, please feel free to put those in the chat box before you leave this presentation. Also, before you leave, please complete the very short poll that you will find to the right of the chat box at the bottom of your screen. This poll will appear on screen as we open the presentation for questions. Now a little bit about our speaker. Kendall Topping is a community forester for the Virginia Department of Forestry. She received her master's degree in natural resource management at the University of Pennsylvania and a bachelor's degree in French at the University of Lynchburg. Her work has ranged from urban forestry in Philadelphia to forestry outreach in Pittsburgh. Her expertise is in native trees and tree stewardship in large cities. When not in rural forests, she can be found in local parks, educating the public on the importance of plant biodiversity. Kendall, we're very much looking forward to your presentation this evening. It's on you now.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Like she said, my name is Kendall Topping, and I'm a community forester with the Virginia Department of Forestry. And let's just get this show on the road. Just bear with me for a minute if I can figure this out. Let's see. It's blocking me a little bit. Here we go. All right. Can everyone see that okay?
That's great.
Okay, awesome. So today we're going to talk about Nature's Expressway, wildlife corridors, and why we need them. And let's get started. So this is a general outline of what we're going to be talking about tonight, starting with what is happening to wildlife, why this is happening, the corridors, how we can help, how do you build one, what are obstacles, and then how the Department of Forestry can help you in achieving these goals. So we'll just start with the problem. As you know, biodiversity is dwindling in massive amounts never before seen in human history. 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction. This is the largest mass extinction in our lifetime. It's because of the biomass of terrestrial vegetation has over halved in its history. And then 2/3 of wildlife has disappeared since 1970. So these are massive problems, specifically due to the success that biodiversity leads into our environmental benefits. Without them, we're going to have a huge problem. So when we talk about the loss of biodiversity, some people don't take it as seriously because one of the #1 leading factors of the loss of biodiversity has to do with insects. When we talk about the mass extinctions, most of those species that are going extinct, other than the large mammals, are actually insects, which is a huge problem because other than right next to plants, they are the basis of many food chains. In fact, due to studies from the UN, we're losing 2.5% of our insect biomass every year. It is not replenishing. And that means within 100 years, we could completely lose all our insect biomass. And this is a huge problem, mainly due to the fact that they're the basis. Also pollination, they're our main pollinators for most of our plant species. So this will negatively affect our agriculture, our gardening in general, and overall our way of life. Another species that is some of the most susceptible are birds, again, because they are one of the species that most heavily relies on insects for their population growth. 96% rely on insects for their young. That would mainly be in the Lepidoptera family, mainly caterpillars, due to their very, very high protein consistency. In fact, since 1970, those numbers have been reduced by 2.9 billion. And this is mainly because of loss of habitat, predation such as outdoor cats, windows, highways, things like that. But still, we're losing a large amount. And a lot of people wonder why. And it's mainly because of habitat loss. There's other reasons, such as the use of pesticide in our agriculture. But as for birds, and a large amount of it, especially in our urban areas, it's due to this large amount of habitat loss. In fact, 2 million acres of forest are developed each year. The picture on the right is just a picture of our light pollution taken from NASA on just how developed and far spread we have become. And one of the major drivers when we talk about habitat loss would be this urban sprawl idea. In fact, around 3% of the US natural land is considered undisturbed. This means without human development ever touching it. Now, this doesn't mean that invasive species haven't come in there as well. It just means that there hasn't been construction work or anything like that of its kind. Another large problem that is fueled by urban sprawl would be the million of highways. There's 4 million miles of highways just in the United States alone, just to connect us with this urban sprawl idea. So what exactly is urban sprawl? Well, urban sprawl is this pattern of uncontrolled development around the periphery of a city. It began mainly in the 1950s when people did not like the growing amount of crowds and noise and lights and overall pollution that was building up in the cities. So they decided to escape to the surrounding area. And this surrounding area became known as the suburbs. It is poorly designed, basically because it was just built in building blocks. There was no overall general schematic for the final product of urban sprawl. It just takes patches of time of land over time and eventually just spreads out. So there's no end game in sight, which is why it's automobile based. There was no design in mind for public transportation. And also because it's low density, people escape the city because of the high density and they want more of their own living space. So it is control. So it has inspired this suburban idea we have now. And this is one of the largest threats to biodiversity, particularly in the United States, because we started off with so much land in the beginning when we colonized North America, that we always assumed that we just have an infinite amount of land that we can always take more and more and more of. Well, nowadays we're running out of land. And this has also increased exhaust pollution, mainly from our automobile dependence, and which also has increased runoff into streams and rivers. The more automobile use you have, the more need you have for parking lots, for streets, things like that. And that is less water going into the ground, like groundwater, and it's instead taking all that pollution and running it off straight into the rivers. Now, unfortunately, this urban sprawl idea isn't going to slow down anytime soon. In fact, it is growing momentum because a large percent of our population is moving to these city-like areas. Not exactly the city, but they want the idea of their own space while being close to everything around them. In fact, the urban population is expected to increase around like 16% around the world, and the built-up area will increase by 3 times. So the population will increase by 13%, but the built-up space will increase by 300, just again due to that low density idea that everybody wants. And this is going to take up a large, significant amount of land. Just to show you the idea of urban sprawl is we have this image right here. This is Atlanta versus Barcelona, just showing how bad and how extreme our urban sprawl is, particularly in North America. As you can see, Barcelona has a larger population by around 300,000, but they only have a tiny, less than 1% of the urban area that Atlanta takes, and an urban density many, many times over. And of course, only around 1/10 of the energy consumption that we do have in the United States. And I think this is a good graph just to show how extreme our urban sprawl has become compared to other areas. So this urban sprawl often leads to habitat fragmentation. To simply put it, habitat fragmentation is when you take a larger habitat, such as a forest, and you divide it in half or cut squares out of it in order for human development, such as the picture shows below. You cut out a small square. Everyone likes to live surrounded by the woods, but they don't want to live in the woods. So they create these little pockets. And it creates this thing called edge effects. So in effect, edge effects are the outside edge of the forest, and that's where different animals and biodiversity can be found rather than the interior. And let's see. Again, with these edge effects, what happens is you have more open vulnerability to invasive species because you have more outer edges and more vulnerability to the sides of the road, to people in general. Normally the alleyways where invasive species spread, especially with insects. On this picture, you have a row of Chinese privet, which is one of the most aggressive invasive species we have in Hampton Roads. It is a shrub. It was planted due to its ability to mass colonize. It was brought over in the 1800s to use as fencing against foxes and things like that. And it's done a little too well at its job, as you can see. And another reason, again, another reason for these invasive species popping up is also deer browsing. Deers are popular animals. Their environment, their native habitat is forest edges against a prairie for grass feeding and then to go hide in the forest. So our habitat fragmentation is actually working pretty great for them. The only problem is that we've deleted their predator, which is the wolves. So their population has exploded and they basically eat the entire forest floor. If you've ever gone in a forest recently, you notice that the ground is bare. It's just leaf litter. It's not originally supposed to be like that. That's basically due to overbrowsing by the deer. With more habitat, such as the edge forest that they enjoy, and no predator, it's reduced them to extreme numbers, which has forced them to overeat and just basically destroy any forest regeneration. Unfortunately, they don't like to eat invasive species for some reason. They don't tend to enjoy their taste as much, probably because they're not familiar with them. They haven't evolved. So this leaves no native regeneration and lets the invasives have more room to grow. And these are just some of the edge effects that can be seen. To better illustrate what I'm talking about, here's a graph that demonstrates the examples of edge habitat. Over here, you have a large forest and it has a significantly large interior habitat with edge. Once you cut a road in and fragment it, you now have more outer edge rather than interior. And it just shows you that the interior species have lost their habitat by around like 50%. And this affects a lot of our birds, specifically the cowbird and things like that. Another term that we also use, especially in urban areas, is habitat islands. This is normally when habitat fragmentation has run its course and all you're left with is a small patch of wilderness surrounded by urban areas. So they're defined as discrete patches of habitat, whether it be forest, whether it be prairie, surrounded by a hostile matrix. And in this case, the hostile matrix would be highways, urban houses, shopping centers, anything that's man-made. And most of these habitat islands are less than 10 acres, which is not enough to sustain even some of the most basic bird species, such as the chickadee. It needs more than 10 acres. If that can't handle these habitat islands, naturally our other species cannot as well. This leads to something known as the small island effect. This is when a certain species that was previously living in this interior habitat hits a breaking point. This is when their population grows to a point where it no longer has the resources it needs in order to sustain the population, not necessarily to grow, but to sustain it. Once it hits this peak, the population plummets and it can no longer recover. And this eventually leads to localized extinction, which is the extinction of native species to the local area, such as in a city or in Hampton Roads in general. Again, this is due to a lack of resources, diversity, and space. They no longer have their own territory. They no longer have diversity in food. In order to get to other areas, they have to go through inhospitable land. And this leads to troubles on the road. When your habitat has been fragmented in half and you need to go to the other side that was previously your territory, you now have to cross a highway or a mall or other people's homes. Hence, large black bears going through people's yards when they build in the forest, things like that. They have to cross what was originally known as their territory into other areas. We can see this a lot, especially with large animals such as deer, elk, bears. And we can see this mainly on the highways, especially in the West. 2 million large animal collisions a year in the US alone. Mainly that is with deer, but it's with other species as well. In fact, it costs the United States over $8 billion a year. And this is mainly due to medical bills and automobile damage. This is a large amount of collisions that are happening. So this habitat fragmentation, loss of diversity, isn't just a threat to the wildlife, it's a threat to us and ourselves. And this doesn't even come close to the amount of small animals that are killed each year. It's estimated that 1 million small animals are killed each day on the road. And by small animals, we mean frogs, snakes, raccoon, voles, mice. In fact, some of these roads have led to the near extinction of a lot of our amphibious species due to the separation of vernal pools. So a basic way to think of this is the Persian rug analogy. We think of a large habitat as a beautiful, expensive, priceless Persian rug. And in its entirety, it's beautiful. It covers up a lot of space, and you can see very, very intricate patterns. However, once you cut highways through it, it becomes a segmented mess, and you can no longer see the whole for what it was. The patterns no longer make sense, the images aren't congruous, and it no longer covers that space. And it's just not the same. It does not serve the same function. And also with a rug, as you notice with edges, if you tend to cut it, it will begin to fray and it will fall apart on itself. We kind of see that as the edge effects affecting a habitat. And slowly these edge effects will merge more and more in with the introduction of invasives and overbrowsing. So eventually the entire segment will peel off in itself, making us lose the rug in its entirety. So we've now introduced the problem. And with urban sprawl continuing to develop at mass numbers, unlike anything seen in our lifetime, we obviously have to think of ways around it. We cannot stop the problem. We mainly need to think of solutions around it. So one solution that people have come up with is this idea of wildlife corridors. So what is a wildlife corridor necessarily? Well, it's a definition that has a vast amount of different interpretations. They can range from large-scale bridges over highways or tunnels underneath small roads or even patches of creek. Mainly, it's just a connection across two different habitats that link up the areas and provides a natural, safe mode of transport for wilderness to occupy back and forth. It must have a healthy environment. It must be safe for the wildlife. And it must allow the free movement of species to find resources such as food and water. Also, it has to be used. If it's not built properly or used, it cannot count as a wildlife corridor. Now, I will note that these wildlife corridors, though they are a great solution, they are just a Band-Aid to the overall problem we're seeing in the United States, but it's a good start. So basically how they work is they work as small tunnels connecting these pieces of rug in a way together. The best way to use them is to have multiple ones going to different habitats. So it works rather as a network chain rather than one small tunnel that just segments one way to another. For wildlife, the best way to have it work is for it to be intricate, almost so it resembles what their habitat used to be from a while ago. And it actually does save lives. This is actually an alligator in a wildlife corridor from Florida. They built this under a highway and they allowed Amphibians, it was mainly designed for amphibians and alligators to go through back to the wetlands. And as you can see, it's being properly used. And to show its success, animal to vehicle collisions have dropped 90% in certain areas in Wyoming due to the presence of these overpasses. Mainly that is a reduction in deer and elk hits. Montana, the same effect is happening. It's reduced collisions by 100%. So when people ask if they work, they actually do work. The problem, the main reason is just to make them as enticing as possible with what used to be the habitat. If you build it, they will certainly come. So this is an example of one of the most expensive wildlife corridors that's ever been built. This is the Trans-Canadian Highway Wildlife Crossing in Banff National Park. As you can see, it's quite significant. This one was mainly used to avoid deer and elk collisions with truckers due to the large amount of highways that go through Canada. And it's actually seen to be quite successful. Fun anecdotes, they've actually noticed that cougars and mountain lions will now sit at the end of the bridges waiting for deer to cross them as an easier way to hunt. So that it's now functioning as a part of the natural wildlife area, and it has been extremely successful. As you can see, though it does not have trees, it has native shrubs and a visual border, so they can't necessarily see the highway as well, so it acts as a natural segue, just part of the environment. Another fun example of one that's a little cheaper and much simpler is the red crab migration wildlife corridor on Christmas Island. I don't know if you've seen the videos, but this is a famous migration that happens once a year that people see, and also leads to havoc due to the local community, as well as a large amount of population decrease just from these guys just getting hit by cars. And as you can see, all it took was a small metal bridge, and they are using it enthusiastically. So these are just some examples of wildlife crossings around the world. This is another famous one. It's an elephant underpass in Kenya. Due to their massive amounts of development in the recent years, they've had large amounts of casualties and car accidents with people and wildlife, so they decided to build this one. And as you can see, it's also working quite successfully. So these are just examples that different countries have used in their interpretation of what a wildlife corridor is. However, what people don't realize is that a wildlife corridor can look very different to other people. You imagine these large overpasses or underpasses, but in fact, they can actually look like this. If you think of a wildlife corridor, you normally wouldn't think of your front yard, your local church, a local high school, or even a local playground. However, these are going to become some of the most wildlife corridors we have in North America. Though they cannot be used for large mammals, we don't want to bring wolves back into the territory, and we're certainly not trying to entice deer either. These will become vital wildlife corridors for some of our most susceptible, as said previously, which are insects and birds. These are able to fly over fences, and this is what we're mainly building these wildlife corridors for. And what is an urban corridor? Well, it's basically a wildlife corridor in an urban environment. So rather than connecting large amounts of habitat, it's basically creating a habitat in itself, basically just stop over, particularly during migrations with insects and birds, someplace they can stop, rest, get food, and keep going, or just another spot that they can enjoy, raise their young, things like that. So it's not necessarily connecting large, massive amounts of habitat, because we don't have that in the urban environment. It's mainly providing habitat in and of itself. And when people think of the urban environment, they think of these barren wastelands that can host no life at all, let alone native species and other biodiverse creatures. However, as our urban areas increase, we have to accept that they may be our last and best opportunity in order to protect these native species. And they can be quite biodiverse. In fact, cities contain 20% of the world's avian population. No, it's not just pigeons and sparrows. Actually, when you look online, it shows that Chicago is one of the largest biodiversity cities in America. It's won an award. Another famous one is Cape Town. Cape Town actually hosts over 3,000 different native plant species in the city itself. It also hosts 50% of all the endemic native plants in the entire country. So just because you're in a large city doesn't mean these things won't work. It doesn't mean we have to be this barren wasteland that we've grown accustomed to. We don't need to be sterile in a way. And just to show that these urban environments are not barren at all, here are some famous culprits. The first one is a coyote. This is in New York City on a roof. People were taking pictures and they were quite worried that it was been seen that there's a coyote in New York City. But in fact, there's always been coyotes in New York City. In fact, there's coyotes in 96% of all cities in the United States. They're all there. Philadelphia, here in Hampton Roads, Washington, D.C. You just don't see them because they're hiding at night and they're very good at eluding prey and predator. But yes, you can find them here too. Another famous one, this is a peregrine falcon in New York City. New York City hosts one of the state's largest populations of peregrine falcons. Why? Mainly because the tall buildings resemble their tall trees or the tall snags they like to stay on when they're hunting for prey. And as for the prey, it's rats and pigeons. Small animals and small birds, that's what they love. And so they've decided to become accustomed to this. And again, this is New York City, which everyone considers to be a barren urban wasteland where no wildlife can thrive. And here we have two very large endemic native species making it their home. In fact, peregrine falcons have become so prevalent in New York City, some bird watchers go there and it's attracted tourism to the city because they want to see the peregrine falcons right outside their window. So these are just some famous examples of the city providing a wildlife corridor and habitat for species that you wouldn't normally think to find there. Another example of this small idea of habitat, island hopping, wildlife corridors, however you want to call it, is Oslo's Bee Highway. They use rooftop gardens, such as the one shown above on the pictures, and they use endemic species to the country. And they use that to attract bees and butterflies all across the city. And they've made a sort of channel to guide the insects out of the city back into more rural areas. And as you can see, it's highly successful. In fact, some members of the community have actually started beekeeping on them because they are working so well. So again, this idea that the city cannot host some of these biodiverse endangered species is in fact false. You just have to know how to properly do it. Another famous example that I think I love, it just highlights how working together as a neighborhood can really make things happen, is this internationally famous Hedgehog Highway in Kirtlington, UK. So since World War II, due to urban sprawl, it's not just a problem in North America. Hedgehogs have decreased a significant amount. There we go, we can hide that. In fact, 90% in the UK. So a lot of the community decided to get together and they have now created 12,000 hedgehog approved gardens. And as you can see, they have little holes like this to allow small mammals to traverse through. Now, obviously this isn't a great idea. If you have an outdoor cat, it's not. But since hedgehogs are mostly nocturnal, you keep your dog inside, I'm sure it's fine. So these are examples of them working. In fact, the neighborhoods have gotten so impassioned about it that they've started making little signs, little stairs. And this is just an example of how they work. This one decided, if it decides to work, yep. He decided to make a slide and he put a camera outside his home at night and he found one of the hedgehogs climbing right up to go through it. So this is just an example how even in a small area, the animals will find it if you plant it. That's just one of my favorite success stories I like hearing. The hedgehog population, at least in this town, has stabilized just because of these examples. Native plants plus little ways to travel, and it's a perfect outcome for everybody. So now that we see that these wildlife corridors or these habitat island hoppers, they actually can work. Now we got to know exactly how to make one in your backyard personally, or how to even get your neighborhood involved. And the main ways to create a wildlife corridor, you need three things. One is shelter, the second is food, and the third is water. If you have these three things, the animals and wildlife are sure to come. That is one of, I believe it's one of the goldfinches we have around here on a coneflower. This picture, though, it is not mine. I have coneflowers in my backyard, and we get around 5 or 6 goldfinch every year just from one row of coneflowers coming up. They enjoy the seeds in winter. They use them as their last food source because the seeds tend to remain on the flower. So this is just another example of just a small, one single bed is enough just for an animal such as a bird or an insect to hop and stay for a little bit for a snack. So an example of shelter. This is our typical suburban lawn. Fun fact, find the prey. If you are a cat or a large bird or a vulture or a hawk, it's very easy to find the prey in this picture. In fact, it's almost ridiculous how easy it is. So when we think about this idea of wildlife corridors, we often think of small perennials, just small flowers. However, this alone will not cut it because it does not cover the idea of shelter, at least not for our songbirds. They need something a little more higher up, a little more stable to protect them from ground predators. So in this picture, it's a little harder. You probably can find the bird, but I bet if you were colorblind, like what many of our predators are, he's a lot harder to find. If you haven't found him, he's right there. And it's just a flat cap hiding in this shrub. And what is their shelter? It's mostly shrubs and trees. They need these large amounts of woody plants in order to hide and disguise themselves with these branches, particularly the mothers who tend to be a little duller in their colors. They often use that to camouflage as well as their nests. So they need these woody plants that they've evolved with in order to hide. This protects them, again, mainly from outdoor cats. Outdoor cats kill millions, if not billions of birds each year just because of their natural predation instincts. Birds of prey as well. If you have nowhere to hide, they're easy pickings. Sometimes humans often are responsible for the killing of birds, most of the time accidentally. Raccoons and then other animals. It's very easy to pick them off. So when you're in a woody plant, particularly one that's thorned or with really thick branches, it's no longer worth the cat or another predator's time in order to get to them. Also, this provides stable branching for their nesting ground. They need something stable to rest against in order to make their nests for the most part. They also need these small twigs to decorate their nests in order to show off. Another example that you may not see in our urban interface as much, which is completely understandable, are snags. These are dead standing trees. This is the term for trees that are dead completely, yet they're still standing. Obviously, we won't see a lot of these in the urban areas, but if you have a large piece of land, it's a good idea to keep them if they're in a safe area with no targets nearby. So let me, sorry, that was my cat. Let me emphasize that. However, these snags are part of a very, very important but disappearing habitat. In fact, they host 85 North American bird species, including our famous ospreys, kestrels, woodpeckers, woods ducks, etc., etc. 60 mammals and amphibians and reptiles, they all use snags, mainly these large cavities that you can see with the owl. That's what they use for their nesting grounds. But also insects. In fact, most of our native bees only use dead wood as their nests and for their food source. And when you remove that dead wood from your area, you're removing that necessary habitat for them. In fact, 1/5 of all wildlife depends on these snags, mainly for habitat use. If you have a large piece of land, it's generally recommended 3 snags per every acre. Again, in the urban environment, this isn't as necessary, and it's most of the time it's not humanly possible. But again, it's something to consider. If you have a larger piece of land and you want to create a snag, there's a couple rules. 1, never have it within falling distance of your home. You think that would be obvious, but it just needs to be said. So if it's nearby any targets, and targets are basically things of value that it could hit, the snag should be removed completely. Any snag that poses a risk should it fall, when it will eventually fall, should be removed. But again, if you have large amounts of land, the larger tree, the better the habitat. Remove large limbs that could pose a risk. And then if you want, you can girdle or cut the tree so the trunk is around 8 feet tall. That's enough for a lot of our species around here. Deciduous species make better snags. And then remember, right tree, right place. But if you have a large piece of land and you'd like to see some owls come nearby, that's a perfect way to create a hot spot for them. The next thing that is probably one of the most important and the most easiest done for our backyards or for these urban areas is food. And as you probably know, most wildlife species, specifically insects, are specialists. They have only one specific host plant. Back in evolution, I'm sure it was great. You noticed no one else is eating this plant. So if you decide to develop to eat it, you'll have no competition with food. It's great. You won't be fighting with anybody. Unfortunately, thousands or millions of years later, it backfired when we got rid of all those plants, and they basically put all their eggs in one basket, and we took away the basket. But basically, they have one specific host plant. It's because plants, for the most part, do not want to be eaten. So they've developed chemical adaptations to make it impossible to eat them. So you have to evolve with it to evolve to metabolize these chemicals. And most young, like I said, young birds feed exclusively on these caterpillars, and these caterpillars are specialists. So if you don't get these plants that the caterpillars prefer, you won't be getting the birds either. So most of the time we say, yes, native is better. However, a lot of people notice that non-native plant species, you see a lot of our native birds eating their berries or their food as well, their seeds, kind of like with calorie pear and nandina. However, specifically with calorie pear, the berries consist of mostly sugars and not a lot of fat or carbs. So in fact, they're kind of like the McDonald's for these birds. There's no consistency, and by eating them, they don't have enough carbs to survive through the winter. And nandina berries are actually dangerous to a lot of birds. They're toxic. And again, that picture is the yucca moth, like its name, it only uses yucca. So when we say what is native? Well, native plants are those that evolved in local areas which it's planted. For example, the bald cypress, that's its native range. Another way to describe native is that it must interact with the native fauna. So something has to eat it, something has to use it. Because native can be very, very tricky when defining, because how do you define a long time ago? Millions or billions? But naturally, we kind of say most of the thousands of years. So just for an example, one on the right is serviceberry. The other on the right is a Bradford pear. If you want to guess at home, how many species does a serviceberry serve? And this is Lepidoptera, so butterflies and moths. Well, on average, the serviceberry has 124 different species that can eat off of it. And if you want to guess how many a Bradford pear has of Lepidoptera, 0. So this just kind of shows you the idea of what we're talking about, native versus non-native. And here's just some photos of some of our native insects. We have the red-spotted purple, which prefers cherries. And by cherries, I mean like black cherry, like Prunus serotina, our native cherries, and willows as well. Then we have the white M hairstreak that prefers its oaks. There's the pink striped oakworm, which prefers only red oak. And then our famous one, the spicebush swallowtail, which only eats from sassafras and spicebush. This is the question mark butterfly. It only feeds off elm. And then there's the zebra swallowtail butterfly, a beautiful example, and it only eats pawpaw. And then this is my favorite. This is a rosy maple moth. It is actually native to this area. However, it's kind of hard to see him because he is designed to look just like a maple seed. But you can sometimes find him. For him, he requires large, large groves of maple trees. So if you have land and you want to see this guy a lot, just plant a lot of maples. But he's kind of my favorite. He's cute. And of course, the most famous specialist we've all heard of is the monarch butterfly. He has become the poster child for this native versus non-natives idea. And this is because it only eats milkweed, because milkweed is toxic. And the monarch butterfly designed itself, one, for less food competition, but also for protection. It makes him taste terrible to birds. But this has become our mascot for this native versus non-native idea. So The key elements, because I'm a forester, we're going to talk about the trees. They are without a doubt the most important element, or at least woody plants. I'll say woody plants, I'll be more generous, are some of the most important elements. Now, if you don't have room for them, perennials are great. But if you have room, woody species are the best. And we'll just go through the list of exactly why they're the best. Trees, it's vital habitat, it's protection from predators. Berries, like I said, windbreaks, when it's a windy storm, the small birds use them. Also, they use them as percussion. So if you hear tapping on a tree, it may not be looking for birds. It may just be attracting a mate to the sound of its own beat. And they also use the wood as beak sharpeners. So if you have a tree, you're more likely to use that than using your house. This is another one that's kind of not normally talked about, but ground zero, and this is the leaf litter, as long as it's not diseased. This is the habitat to some of our most important biodiversity susceptible creatures, such as spiders and decomposers. And actually, people don't realize that leaf litter, not only is it good for the soil, but it's also shelter for fallen pupa and chrysalis. Over here is the Luna moth, and that on top is its chrysalis. And it hides in fallen leaf litter. So if you rake up your leaf litter, you may be throwing this guy in the garbage on accident. So in order to protect them, there's no point of attracting a large amount of insects if you're just going to throw them away once the leaves fall. So keep that in mind. You don't want to create a trap. And then of course, fallen seeds and fruit. And then another one people don't think about a lot is our water streams. Trees are vital for nutrient absorption, and particularly in reduction of nitrogen, which comes from feces, our fertilizer, agriculture, things like that. It reduces it by 88% if it goes through at least 50 feet of forest buffer first. Also, if you're by the river and you want more fish, fish prefer lower water temperatures, and that is what tree shade is used for. It also absorbs these nutrients, again, to prevent that bacteria and algae buildup for these dead zones that we like to call them. They're areas with zero oxygen and nothing can live there, particularly fish. However, once you get trees in there, they absorb a lot of those nutrients that the bacteria cannot eat it, and you have restoration of these areas. Also, roots are the #1 habitat for fish eggs. They use those to hide their offspring. And then again, fallen leaf litter is vital habitat and food for macroinvertebrates. And macroinvertebrates are the main food source for most of our fish. They are the basis of the food, of the aquatic food chain. And you will find those mainly in fallen leaf litter. Fallen leaf litter also provides carbon to the water, which again helps with this vitalization process. So now we go into which species are the best. Some species are better than others, sadly. And the #1 is, of course, the oaks. Oaks are the powerhouse of the natural world. One white oak tree, there's 532 different species of Lepidoptera alone that use it for their sole food source. Unfortunately, it is very slow growing and it takes a lot of space. So if you have space and time, plant a white oak. If you don't, please do not plant a white oak. Willows are the next one. They're shrubby. They're hard to find in nurseries, but a great example is our black willow. They're great to plant by the riversides. They tolerate flooding. The only problem is they have very weak wood. So again, it's not an ideal urban tree. White oak is a better urban tree. Willows are not as much. Cherries are another huge one. Again, native cherries, such as black cherry. Over 100 different species of host insects. They're shrubs or trees, and there's different shrubs and there's different trees. You can pick which one. Only thing to keep in mind for this guy is they have relatively short-ish lives, and when they get to the end of it, they tend to fall apart. Of course, if you're planting it now, it would take you like 50 years to get to that point, but just something to keep in mind so you don't build it next to your house. Hickories are another one, but for this one to be important, you have to leave the nuts on the ground for animals to pick up. They're great statement trees, and they can be up to 100 feet tall. And this is our famous shagbark hickory. Now, we also have to say, I cannot neglect shrubs. Shrubs are often overlooked, but they are some of the most important habitat and food sources for our wildlife, especially in urban areas where trees may not be the best option. So one example is vacciniums. This isn't just blueberry. This also includes deerberry and other shrubs such as that. I can't think of the rest of the Latin names on the top of my head, but most are edible by humans. They're loved by birds, hundreds of species of Lepidoptera. The only concern with these guys is they like really acidic soil. So if your soil tends to be basic, like a lot of soils in the urban area, this might not be the best choice for you. However, viburnums may be. They're a native staple. They're extremely showy, have beautiful fall color, and they're loved by birds, and they can only be up to around 20 feet tall. You just have to be very careful because there are a lot of different cultivars of non-native viburnums, and a lot of these, in fact, most of these tend to be invasive just because they're so sturdy. So be very, very careful, especially at stores or nurseries, to make sure you know what you're getting. Some great examples of viburnums: possum haw viburnum, black haw viburnum, maple leaf viburnum. These are just some examples of the very popular viburnums that are beloved by our insects. Alders is another one too. They are great for the banks of rivers. They're great for erosion control. They produce thickets. So if you're on the river, this is a great choice for you. Only problem is deer love them. So if you have a deer problem, these might not be the best for you. When you're building a wildlife corridor, you have to kind of start small at first if you want to start. So the way we start, at least at my home, we started in patches and just expand the beds we already have slowly but surely. However, if you want to get right into it and create the best you can, it's best to remember layers, different habitats and different levels, the soil, leaf litter, and then only use chemical pesticides responsibly. Again, you don't want to create a trap for them. And remember, biodiversity. More plant diversity means you get more different wildlife. And this means different habitat, like we said, and levels. Varying flowering fruiting time. If you only have things that flower in the summer, you're not going to get anything in the winter. That's just how it works. And then various ages. You don't want everything to die at the same time because then you've created this wasteland. And remember, bigger trees, bigger benefits. Extant large trees produce 8 times more benefits than small stature or younger trees. Since they're already large, that upfront cost of planting them and getting them established is already paid. So keep them when you can. And again, there's more space for habitat. What I mean by that is this picture. So all of these are warblers, but they all use a different part of the tree for their habitat. As you can see by the outside, some use outside edges, some use the interior, and some use lower areas. So this just shows that one tree can produce habitat for very different species just because it's larger and has more room to. The reservation with large trees, if I have enough time, is that unfortunately we lose a large amount of them, and that's because of things like storm damage. The people are terrified of large trees destroying their houses, and that's honestly understandable. And that's because of the media produces this doomsday image, as you can see, of these large trees destroying properties. However, if you think about it, in reality, there's only a 1 in 4 million chance of death due to tree failure, and that's on par with legal execution. The reason it's shown so prevalently is because all the trees, I can't say all, but at least a large majority of the trees that fall during these doomsdays, they already had problems to begin with. So they were already susceptible, they were already ill, they were already weak. In fact, healthy trees protect areas and have less debris. Neighborhoods with the most tree cover have the least amount of damage and debris from storms. In fact, trees protect homes. If the wind doesn't hit your tree, it's going to hit your roof. And this is just an ideal planting to protect your house from wind damage, and it shows how the wind can go around. Sorry, I'm speeding through this. I'm running out of time. So the key is to keep your tree healthy and plant. This is specifically for storms as well. Plant trees in groups and right tree, right place. So when you're planting those native species, remember this key. Small trees are best 10 by 10 feet. Medium trees, 20 by 20. Large trees, 30 by 30, especially in urban areas. This will keep them nice and plenty of room. So examples such as these, this is not right tree, right place. And under a power line, again, don't plant a white oak under a power line. It's probably not a good idea. Plant a serviceberry, if anything. And plant it and they will come. In fact, 0.6 acres of a native garden, they had a recording of over 149 bird species, including this woodcock over here, just in 1 year. 1 acre 0.1 acre, recorded 116. It's possible for even these small areas to create a wildlife oasis. And especially if you get like neighboring houses involved, you can create an entire habitat and community. Local example is the Newport News Bee Byway. That is a very small example of what can be done. All it takes is small patches of land. This is by the Mariners Museum with the signs, just to create a pathway for our bees to go through. And this was created by 2 teenagers on a robotics team. So if they can do it, we can do it. And if you want to start, how can we help? Well, I'm with the Department of Forestry, and we create tree planting plans, species recommendation lists for public properties, cities, organizations, HOAs. If it's a large group of people, we can be there to help. We do outreach like this, and we also have large grants available, such as these 2 grants. If you're interested, feel free to contact me. We also do forest health surveys. So, and that is my contact information for the Blackwater region, and then there's contact for the Capital region, and then that's for further information. I'm so sorry, I went over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendall. That was excellent. Candy, do you have some questions in the chat room?
I do indeed. One person said, living in a crowded townhouse neighborhood, what can I do to support wildlife in my area? How can I help?
Well, if you have when you have a crowded townhouse, sometimes it's best, obviously, not to do trees. However, sometimes if you have medians, if you work with a homeowners community, we've done this before in the public spaces, in medians, outside, or by the leasing company, they're often open to these tree plantings. But if you have a very small space, perennials may be just the best option for you because that's just the room you have. But if you have room for woody species and it's not enough for a tree, I would definitely recommend some of these smaller shrubs. One of my favorite is, I may be butchering the Latin name, but it's like Ceoanthus americanus. It's New Jersey tea plant. It only gets to 3 feet tall, and at least in my yard, the lightning bugs love it. So there are small shrubs out there that you can use in a small space. Just remember, research its tolerances, what it can tolerate. For example, if you live near a swamp and flooded area, New Jersey tea plant will not be good for you. It tolerates drought once it's established. So it's good in those tough areas, but it wouldn't do well in the swamp. So there are some smaller species that you can still use. And with those flowers, I think the most important part is you have to show these townhouses that native doesn't mean wild and unruly. It can still look small, compact, and beautiful. You just have to show them.
Okay, another question is, planting cherries, are they good to become snags later?
They can be, specifically the black cherry, the Prunus serotina. They can be, they're deciduous. They tend to fall apart and create cavities easier. They can, again, not the best in an urban environment because they can produce hazards, but they tend to be raggedy like that. And though they're not the best because they do decay rather quickly, so they won't make the best snag for the long term, but they'll make a pretty good one for a temporary time. And by temporary, I mean like a few years or so. So I'm not talking like a month. Typically, the stronger the wood, like oaks, those are the best snags because they'll stay for years and years, but cherries will do just as well if you have the space.
All right, are blueberries from the store good or not so much? Do you need a special native version?
The hard part with, I've had this question a lot with the blueberries in the store. Sometimes they can be specific cultivars and sometimes they can be designed to repel pests or things like that. My gut feeling is if you're not exactly sure where it came from, then I wouldn't necessarily use it. Some of the blueberries in the store, they don't say what their Latin name is. So they could be a hybrid, which isn't the best. I would typically go for a native plant nursery where you know the total Latin name. I have bought blueberries from the stores such as Lowe's and Home Depot. I haven't seen any problems with them, but I haven't seen anything eating them either. So that's one of those you can experiment with, but I'm not entirely sure. And my gut feeling is to, if you have room for something else, go for something else.
All righty. Another person asked, I have practiced leave your leaves for the past 2 winters, but I'm never sure when in the spring I can move them for shredding or redistribution in my yard without undoing the benefits to insects and their eggs of the winter. What is your recommendation?
For that leaf litter, I know it can be a problem. I think if you gently rake it, you can move it to different beds. I would not chip it, but another tip is depending on when you chip it. If you're looking for specific insects, look up their life cycle and look up when they're in their chrysalis and cocoon. Because normally when they're not in those, such as when they're in the adult phase, it's perfectly safe to chip those if you would like. Just check their life cycle. If none of them are going to be at that pupa stage, you don't have the risk of shredding them, of killing these pupa. So that just, if you want, do some research on their life cycle, pick a month or a week where they're not actively in that stage, and then you can go to town.
Another question. What's your favorite or best recommendation for native small or medium trees for a front yard?
Black gum. This is Nyssa sylvatica. It gets up to 40 to 60 feet tall. I love the berries. They are great berries for birds, and their small flowers smell relatively nice. And they're a hot spot for native bees. Native bees really love their flowers and their nectar. And it tends to be a tree that's tolerant of a lot of urban conditions. So that is definitely my favorite tree. And serviceberry is a great one for small areas. It gets to 25 feet tall. It's definitely the best small tree that you will find. That and eastern redbud, that's another great one. The only problem with serviceberry is it can be kind of hard to find since it's become really popular in the last few years with the native plant movement. It's one of my favorites. The berries are edible, they're delicious. It's just gonna be hard finding one.
One more question. When is it safe to pull up hollow old stems?
Oh, that's a good question. So a lot of you know, pulling up these old stems in the winter is not the best idea because that's where the insects lay over to protect themselves from the cold. I would say once the last frost is definitely done, I would say when it's been warm for a large period of time, I would probably say like in April or May, but if that's too late, do what you do. That would be my personal opinion. If you have still periods of cold, don't touch them.
All right, we got a question from someone about when they can see, if they can see this presentation again, and it will be on the website, the very same one you used to access this talk. It'll be up in probably about a week. So if you want to come back in a week, if you got friends, family, etc., you think need to see this, then that's the time to do it. And all the old presentations are stored there.
All right, any other questions, Candy?
No, except we're getting lots of thank yous. Great presentation. Thank you very much. It was wonderful. You're a hit, Kendall.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks.
Then let me add my thanks, Kendall. It was an excellent presentation, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Please join us again on April the 18th for discussion about bees, the good, the bad, and the ugly at 7 p.m. via Zoom. You can find the link for that Zoom program at the Virginia Beach Master Gardener website, just like you did tonight. Thank you, everyone. Please continue to put your poll results in. And Kendall, thank you so much.
No problem. If you have any other questions or if you have an organization, an HOA that would like a planting plan, feel free to reach out to us. That's what we do.